Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. Today's discussion in the Gospel of John is chapter 2, and the woman at the well, start that over. It's the water turned to wine story. The woman at the well is coming, but right now it'll be the water turning to wine. This is John 2, verses 1 through 12. Good to have you back, Mike. How have you been?
Been good. It's been a whirlwind of a couple of weeks of getting a lot of little side projects and juggling things out of the way.
Life is a bunch of projects, isn't it, though? And let's begin this way. Because of this story, it will end by this phrase, this is the beginning of signs that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. So the water to wine story is what John will call the first of the signs or the miracles of the book. We'll talk about this as we get into it. Mm-hmm. Clearly, Jesus must have been doing numerous things, because by the time we get to chapter 3, Nicodemus will say, no one can be doing all these things that you're doing unless God be with him. So there must have been a pile of things or a list of things that Nicodemus could have been referring to. And so the story here, though, for us, for our study in John, again, from a DCW viewpoint, we're not going to study the miracle on every level, but simply I'm going to take it from the level of, or the angle of, how does a DCW worldview look at this sort of story. But let me ask this to you again off the cuff as we begin, because it really is on topic. Have you ever experienced a miracle? And if you have, how do you know? How did you know?
Well, so, I mean, I guess it would not be a miracle in some people's eyes, where it's not like I saw fire from heaven. But I would say this was even before I became a Christian. And it was actually part of the journey, my own faith journey, of how I came into the faith. I was 15 years old, and I was doing my first summer job at a summer day camp, basically. And on one of these particular days, we took all of our kids, and they were all like around 5, 6-year-olds. So we took all of our kids to a field trip. And long and short, there was a hazing moment, because I was a new junior counselor, and they thought it would be hilarious to drop me into the pond where all the other kids were playing. The unfortunate thing was, the majority of everyone except my manager and some of the lifeguards, I can't swim. And I figured, growing up as a kid, I saw all these G.I. Joe PSAs of like, oh, if you get, end up in the water, you'll be fine. Just do, scissor legs and you'll be fine. So I thought that, but after they dropped me into the water, my body panicked and I almost drowned. And thankfully, one of the lifeguards saw what happened and was already running towards me before they even dropped me into the water. He got me out, and I went up the hill afterwards to change and to just recuperate. But after I got into that dressing room, I essentially had a terrible replay of the events going over in my mind repeatedly. And every time it happened, I would just break down crying. I just could not get a coherent thought. I had gone to church, but I hadn't actually committed anything. I hadn't committed to Christ. But I remember in the midst of when I had a lucid moment, when the replay paused for a moment, I remember just crying out, God, if please send someone to help me, whether heavenly or earthly.
When you were in the water, you mean?
After this was out of the water. It was just the fact that the replay of the event just kept going over and over and over in my mind. And I just cried out. And then, of course, the replay kicked in again, and I couldn't even finish my prayer. I don't know how many minutes or how long it was after I was able to say something. A guy came up to me in the dressing room. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and I looked up at him because he was a middle-aged white guy in like Bermuda shorts and like a Hawaiian t-shirt. And he just simply looked at me and said, like, I don't know what happened to you or who did this to you. But what I do know is that you're hurting. And I just want to let you know that Jesus loves you. And he, handed me like a gospel tract in my hand. And as he walked away, he stopped and said, by the way, my name is Mike too. And some reason after he said that, after that whole event, like the replay that was happening in my mind, it stopped. I was able to actually pull myself back together. And I made it through the rest of the day without crying, without breaking down. It was only until when I got back home and I told my family about what had happened. And again, yes, we cried, but it wasn't as bad as it was at that initial moment. That was part of the journey of like essentially the catalyst that started me down, finally searching for what would have happened to me if I did pass out, if I did drown. Because I was one of those guys who thought, I'll accept Jesus on my deathbed. That I wanted to live my life the way I wanted. And that event shook me because it made me realize I had no control over what happens to me. And there was no guarantee that I would even have a moment like in my old age on a deathbed, having time to be able to say, yes, I want to commit my life to Jesus. Mm-hmm. And yeah, to me, that was a very small miracle in the fact that I do believe that God actually heard my cry.
Do you think that was an angelic being in a sense, or did you know the man who did this for you?
No, did not know the guy.
Oh, okay.
No idea who he was. I would say I think he is an angel in the sense of messenger. Because I do remember that I said that, please send someone to help me, heavenly or earthly. Because I was so desperate. And if he was a divine being that was dressed up as a middle-aged guy with Bermuda shorts and a t-shirt, that's terrific. Yeah,
sure.
If he was simply a fellow servant of Jesus, that's just as terrific.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's cool. I ask you that question because if someone were to ask me, have I ever experienced a miracle, I would probably say no, in the sense that I don't know of a time when natural law was suspended for me. I do have a couple of stories in which something happened and I look back and I say either that was providentially amazing. I mean, the number of things that had to line up for that to happen are beyond what I would call rationally possible. On the other hand, I do have one or two, people that have shown up in my life where very simple stories, less critical than your story, but where a person, for example, I'm standing in line with my son at a hockey game, and I had promised him, he was like 10 years old, and I had promised him to go to a hockey game, and he said, "Hey, Dad, this is our last game, or it's the last game of the season for the North Stars, or the Wild, Minnesota Wild. Can we go?" And of course, I had promised him, so I didn't have any tickets though, and I just went down to get in line, and a guy walked up to me. This is in St. Paul, and he said, "Hey, Prof. Johnson," and he said, "I got 2 tickets. You want them?" And I said, "Yeah." I had never seen this guy in my life. Okay, and he said, "Yeah, I had you for class last year. Remember?" And I feigned that I remembered him. I had never seen him in my life. And to this day, I think, did I really? I mean, he sat in my class for a semester. If he did, if he was telling me the truth that, he was a student of mine. But how come I had never seen this guy before, in my understanding? And could that have been an angel? Now that, talk about a silly way, or I don't know what you want to call that, a low-level angel mission, right? Where God sends somebody down to give Johnson a pair of tickets because he had promised his son a hockey game. At the same time, that's maybe what angels do. That's maybe what God is in the business of doing in his covenant with us, where we need something. And I like the range of what we've just talked about here. almost drowning and not having tickets to a hockey game are, two ends of the spectrum, obviously. And could it be that God's in the business of aiding both of us in times of need? And so, that's an introductory thought. And again, I appreciate off the cuff just being able to ask you these things, because today it is the discussion about the first, quote, sign or miracle in the book of John. Let's go through the miracle quickly in John 2. And then let's talk about Jesus' relationship to the miraculous. And specifically, as we close, how does a DCW force us to consider the stories of the miraculous? I think that is where we could spend our best time as a DCW podcast. So let's get into the story. I'll read from John chapter 2 and just make a small comment as we go. Again, you would be well advised to have a good study Bible for this kind of a story, especially a cultural study Bible, because they can give background where we just don't have time. Verse 1, chapter 2, on the third day there was a wedding at Cana, it's just outside of Nazareth, in Galilee, and Mary was there. Now, I'm going to say Mary, but in the text it says the mother of Jesus. It's interesting how Mary's never named in the Gospel of John, though she shows up numerous times, and it's always the mother of Jesus. So for some reason, the writer, I'm sure who knew her name, always uses the moniker, the mother of Jesus. So Mary's there. So this would have been a family wedding, a large gathering. We are in the early stages of Jesus' 3-year ministry. All of this information in John 2 is fitting in. Let's see how we could say this. John chapters 2 through 4 all happens between Matthew 4:22 and 4:23. Also between Mark 1 verses 13 and 14, and between Luke 4 verses 13 and 14. So we have these stories starting in John 2 all the way through John chapter 4 that fit into a very quick window in the synoptics. And here's one of them: Jesus going to a family wedding. Jesus, verse 2, Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, Mary said to him, "They have no wine." Now again, wine would be a normal staple for a family wedding like this. And as you could guess, running out of wine would be a terrible embarrassment to the host. Jesus said to her, "Woman," and this is literally how it reads in Greek, "what does this have to do with me, or what between you and me? My hour has not yet come." We've wondered what he meant by that, but again, for sake of time, my guess, Mike, would be that he's just saying, from what I can tell in the ministry that I have begun, again, starting with Mark 1, he's already in a ministry now, a full-time ministry. I think he's sensing the will of the Father so clearly, so carefully, and so hour to hourly, that he's saying to his mother with the normal phrase gune, or woman, which can be said nicely. It's not as crass as it may sound in English. He's simply saying, Mom, from what I know, this is not my time to do anything. Something very gentle like that. His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Maybe she had some sense that there is something possible to happen. Again, we just don't know the background of this. And by the way, here's a good example as we get on to the next verses. This is a story that I'm sure traveled orally through the Christian community well before the book of John was written, because as we're going to read forward here, the miracle never is told to happen. The miracle is reviewed by the writer as though everyone knew what happened, and we'll see that coming up. So again, all to say that this kind of a written text follows behind the oral story by probably a generation or two, and people already know the story, and the kids that are listening to John being read are already anticipating what's going to happen because they know the story itself. John continues, now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, again showing the importance of ritual purification in the Jewish lifestyle, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. This must have taken some time, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. And then notice how the text presumes you know what happens. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. He said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now, probably said with a little bit of a stupor himself, off the cuff. By the way, this is really good stuff. How come you held it to the end? And this is where then John, or the gospelist, makes his summary statement that we can then dive into this concept today for our discussion. This, the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory. So John doesn't use the word miracle here in Greek. He uses the word semeion, or sign, which seems to be a careful choice of words that may include the miraculous, upending nature. It can also be used, semeion can also be used as a non-miraculous, just a statement or an action that Jesus will do. So this is John's way of saying, here's the first of what I'm going to call a sign that will manifest, quote, his glory, which again doesn't have to mean Jesus is gleaming or shining. It just means the weight, the importance of who Jesus is being shown through this moment. And his disciples believed in him. And then, of course, he heads down to Capernaum, which is, again, just a day's walk from Cana. Any thoughts on the text before we jump into the how a DCW works through the concept of the miraculous? That's where I'd like to spend our time.
Well, I guess, for the last couple of years, and I'm curious how about what you think of this possible explanation. Because one of the things that, people will note is that this miracle is unique. Right, it's unique in comparison to the other synoptic gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have this. I remember learning years ago in church history, and one of the texts we had to have with us was the church history written by Eusebius, from the 4th century. And one of his interesting explanations about why John's gospel, if this is written by the Apostle John, was apparently his students had asked him why was his gospel account different, like significantly different from synoptics. And apparently he had read the other 3. He knew of the other 3. He thought that they were accurate. But what he noted was that they focused on years 2 and 3 of Jesus' ministry. And he wanted to tell and provide the information from year 1. And so it would seem to correlate if this is, often this miracle at Cana, or this whole entire turning the water into wine at Cana is referred to as the first miracle that Jesus, or first indication that Jesus is possibly the Messiah, and that it's described that way as like the first time. And so that would correlate with the idea that this is coming from year 1. So I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are about that.
In fact, that would be where I'd like to go next in my order of study this morning, would be that question of how this miracle fits into John's story. And so let's do that. And I'll give you my thoughts as I do. The miracles in the Gospel of John, there's 7 actual miracles recorded. He'll say at the end of the book that he couldn't have possibly, in no book in the world can hold up, everything that Jesus did. So he gives away at the end that Jesus must have had, at least in reputation, a fantastic number, just quantity of things that would have led people to believe he was the Messiah, or at least he said, who he said he was, right? So, but it's interesting that if you add them up in John's book, you only get 7. So chapter 2, water to wine. Chapter 4, the healing of the official son. Chapter 5 will have a story of a pool at Bethesda, just north of the Jerusalem wall. In chapter 6, we have a feeding of a multitude. Also in 6, he walks on water. In chapter 9, he heals a blind man. And then, of course, in chapter 11, he raises Lazarus. So those are the 7 miracles in John. 4 of the 7 deal with healing. That leaves 3 of the 7, like this one, to be miracles dealing with nature, shall we say, water to wine, feeding of the multiplication of food and walking on water. As we note then, only one of these miracles of the 7 is in all 4 Gospels, and that would be the feeding of the 5,000. That's also in John. So the only miracle that's in all 4 Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. That leaves the other 6 then, including today's miracle, as unique to John. And so all but the feeding of the multitude is unique. And so now we're led to the question, as you just kind of brought up, like Eusebius was thinking in the 4th century, why did John include the ones he did? I'm going to recommend this near the end of our study in the book, especially as you get to the very end, when he even says, John does at the very last couple of verses, that these things are written by the one who was called the loved disciple. And my guess is that this kind of goes along with Eusebius. John, or the writer of the book, the person who had the source to these things, must have known Jesus better than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And that would not have been difficult, because neither Mark nor Luke was a disciple. Matthew was, but he only met Jesus again, later in his ministry when he starts. He gathers 12 disciples. And so, if Jesus had a best friend, presumably someone who knew him early on, and then even was a part of his ministry, remember he was followed by many more than just the 12. And if that person was the source of stories to the writer of the Gospel of John, then it makes sense that he would have, in this case, 6 miracles that the other Gospels don't even have. So whether it's the first year of Jesus, that could be. The first 3 do happen very early. And so, yeah, I don't know why we have these 6 unique ones, but it would make sense to me that you're talking to someone who has a memoir on the life of Christ beyond what the 12 disciples would have known. So that's my guess. How about we go in this direction? And here's where, let's just do this. What I'd like to do is ask ourselves and really just collate a lot of historical discussion here by asking this question: what were the possible reasons for Jesus' miracles? And when you ask the books that, or our commentators over these last years, what do you think are the reasons that Jesus did miracles? There's quite a list. I mean, you can find, if you collate the list, it can grow into the dozens of reasons. So what I'd like to do is just go through what I'm hearing as to possible reasons for Jesus' miracles, and then reflect on that when it comes to a DCW. Okay? So possible reasons for Jesus' miracles. Number 1, and again, these are things I've heard, and so let me just go through them and then make comments on them, and especially return to one of them. In fact, I'm going to return to the first one, which is this: to demonstrate that he was God. You may hear this. This will be not an uncommon, I remember being taught it when I was in, a bachelor's Bible college work, that the reason Jesus would say, hey guys, gather around, watch this, pow, and he would do a miracle, is to demonstrate that he was, capital G, God. And so that has often been said. What I'd like to do, Mike, is return to that as a discussion at the end of the list. Okay. Number 2, and here's where you can jump in, Mike, at any point and give me your opinions. I like this list that I'm about to read, though I do have some concerns about whether it proves it, right? So like number 2, to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. It's possible that there are times that a person would see a miracle of Jesus and think of an Old Testament prophecy, but I think that's rather narrow. I doubt there were many times that actually happened. Number 3, to invite everyone into God's kingdom. It says in Mark 1:15, after he announces the kingdom, that the power of his ministry begins, and he starts doing things, shall we say, miraculously, that gives people the impression that they are entering into a world into which God himself now has power over the elements of nature, that kind of a thing. Number 3, these are generally, again, what people have said over the years, to glorify the Father. True, not that you have to do a miracle to do that, but could it be in some sense that doing an act that defies physical law somehow, in some way, glorifies Yahweh more than something else? Apparently that is one possibility. Number 5, authority over nature, to show authority over nature. Like the walking on water, and however that would have worked in Matthew 14, for example. Again, did he do it to show authority over nature? Possibly. Did Jesus always have authority over nature? That's where we would probably have to back off and say he probably lived under the authority of nature on most situations. When he dropped a nail as a carpenter, it followed the laws of gravity, I'm suspecting, and he had to reach down and pick it up, something as simple as that. So everything we know about Jesus is that he lived a normal human life on one level, at least, and that nobody came to him and said, and remember, there are these fanciful stories that come out about Jesus later. The Gospel of the Infancy is a 2nd century document where Jesus stretches boards that are too short, things like that they're really silly. So we want to be careful and say that when we say that Jesus shows authority over nature in his miracles, that does not imply or mean that he, at any given moment, could break natural law, right?
So you're saying Jesus was not a Jedi?
Yeah, thank you for the modern way of saying it. He wouldn't have known what that meant, but I think I know what you mean. So, Number 6, authority over life and death. Well, here's where in the raising of Lazarus, some have said this is his showing of authority over death. And again, I can see that. But again, there's only 3 times that we know of that he raises a dead person. What always astounds me, Mike, is how many miracles Jesus could have done and didn't. Right? I mean, from age 0 to 30, we don't know of any miracles. And then even from 30 to 33-ish or so, he does 35 recorded miracles. John says you couldn't have recorded them all, so that gives impression that he did a lot of things. But it's interesting, he only raised 3 people from the dead that we know of. And so, yes, does he show authority over life and death? Yes, in those moments. And we need to appreciate that on that level.
Though to be fair, right, that the last one, being Lazarus, that pretty much led to the decision that he was going to have to be killed, right? So I think like he did it 3 times, which is terrific, but the last time it definitely showed that it started threatening the power structures of
very much so
of the society. That okay, if this truly happened, and if we allow this to continue, that he can raise people from the dead. All of a sudden, the power brokers of that day said, we can't let this continue. And so I do think he was very judicious in that he only raised 3 people in 3 years.
Interesting.
Knowing that the last one essentially was the catalyst in at least John's gospel.
Exactly.
Of the whole entire pursuit to murdering Jesus.
Sure. It's a very curious moment. Number 7 in my list, to prove his messianic identity. That's what I've read, heard. The problem with that, if I'm going to call it that, is that let's imagine for a moment, what if Jesus had never done any miracles? Could he still be the Messiah? To which the answer would be, sure. right? I mean, you don't have to do a miracle to be the Messiah in any sense that I'm aware of, theologically. The fact that he did a miracle, thus, does it prove he is the Messiah? I would say I would be careful in making that claim that he did a miracle to prove he was the Messiah. Does that make sense? Number 8, here's again where when you come to Matthew 14 and he feeds the 5,000, feeding the hungry, is that why Jesus did miracles? Sometimes miracles, or like the feeding of the 5,000, is used in a sermonic applicational sense to say Jesus fed the hungry, therefore we need to feed the hungry. Bring a canned food next week to church so we can feed the hungry. Do you see the misapplication there? Jesus doesn't spend his life feeding the hungry. He could have done it a lot more than he did, frankly, but he feeds them here. So does he do miracles to feed hungry people? He did a couple of times, 3,000 in Mark and 5,000 in Matthew. So he can do that, but I think, again, he doesn't do it in order to, as though he needs to fulfill a need in his mind that people are hungry, therefore I'm going to do miracles. It seems to be less for the reason of feeding people and more the reason of trying to show something else, as it were, in that moment. Number 9, to show compassion to the sick. Again, can we take yeah, go ahead.
Well, I am curious, just to pause on that for a moment. I mean, would it be fair, though, to say that in the feeding of the hungry, he expressed compassion? That, I mean, it could be coming from a place of just deep well of compassion and desire to care for people, right? It's not necessarily the reason, but that was the motivation of, ultimately, it was a good thing to feed the 4,000, the 5,000, and right. To see them like, well, we're in the middle of nowhere. There are no McDonald's and Burger Kings on the road. Right.
Yeah, I don't want to minimize that Jesus felt bad for people who are hungry. At the same time, I'm sure Jesus passed many hungry people without feeding them too. So there's that back and forth in my mind about whether miracles were for the purpose of alleviating pain, as much as there were times when Jesus was overcome possibly by his noticing pain and wanted to do something about it. So good. Number 9, then show compassion to the sick. Is that a reason for his miracles? Well, again, Matthew 14, when he heals someone who's ill, that certainly is a motivation, I'm sure, in Jesus' mind, that he wanted to help someone who was sick. I am amazed, again, in my mind's eye, how many times Jesus probably saw illness and did not heal, though. So we have to take that in some sense into account. Number 10, bring in the marginalized. There will be times that he talks to, let's say, a woman at the well. That's in John chapter 4 coming up. Or he talks to and even touches a leper. So to bring in the marginalized, I would agree, would be part of the reasons that Jesus does miracles. But again, it doesn't. There are numerous again, people who are marginalized that Jesus may not do a miracle for. So we have to always take that into account. Number 11, relieve the demon-possessed. Well, that does happen. Jesus does show his power over the spiritual world, and being the Lord of spirits, shall we say, is going on during Jesus' ministry, not at the end of it, but during his ministry. And so he's showing his power to relieve those who are possessed of devils. And how that works, again, we don't have much information except just the report of the stories, but those are fascinating. And we don't have any of those in John. Interestingly, there are no demon exorcisms in John. So if we want to talk through those, we will have to go outside of John to do it. And we will at times when we get to John 8, things like that. And I'll express why we'll do it then, but we'll get there. Number 12, comfort the grieving. I've heard that as well. That's true. But again, is that the only reason he does a miracle? No, it certainly includes it in his emotional response to people. Number 13 is interesting, to aid the disciples' faith. And you do get, this is from Matthew 11, verses 3 through 5. I think the reason we've included this as a reason for Jesus' miracles is that he probably felt at times these men who were obviously being asked to believe something pretty astounding, and that is that all of human history is coming to climax in this man standing in front of them, right? I mean, this is an amazing moment for them, and the Mount of Transfiguration will be a good example of where they're being led to believe and realize, this is my beloved son. This is the one that everything has been angling toward. So at times I wonder if Jesus did do a miracle just to say in the back of his mind or under his breath, I hope this helps these guys, because they are being asked to believe quite a chunk of information that no one has seen before, that time in world history. So I think Jesus did do some things just to help the disciples. Number 14 in my list, to teach spiritual lessons. The cursing of the fig tree in Mark 11 is actually played out over two sets of verses 12 to 14, and then repeated in verses 20 to 25, as though to say, Jesus does a miracle, curses a fig tree. Then the writer comes back around the other side of the miracle and expresses why he did it, as though it's a spiritual lesson about the fruitlessness of Israel. So maybe he does a miracle at times to draw people in and say, here's something I want to teach you through what I just did.
That's also the passage where most people would turn to about, if you only have enough faith, you can move mountains. And it's like over the years, my lead pastor has kind of dismantled that for me and my congregation of just it's a particular mountain. It's a particular mountain that's being moved, not the generic, the difficulty mountains in my life kind of issue. There's something going on here, and that cursing of the fig tree and everything that goes around it was like, wow, there's definitely something going on in this moment.
Good point. Yeah. We all have mountains we wish we could move, and they don't. 15, to teach dependence on the Father. This is from John 11, and I think this is a good point to be brought up, that in John 11, when he's raising Lazarus from the dead, he still prays to the Father and has this moment of intimacy with the Father about his friend Lazarus who has died. And you get the feeling that Jesus is doing this raising of Lazarus not just on a whim. All right, this is something deeply relational between both him and Lazarus, and also Jesus and the Father, and they have this, as it were, conversation about doing this miracle, and who knows, again, the psychology of Jesus and how he apparently stayed behind, right, 3 or 2 days so that Lazarus would die, and all this going into the story seems to be a story not just of Jesus and Lazarus, but Jesus and the Father and how they related. 16, to confirm his preaching. Now, this is out of a dubious passage in Mark 16 at the very end. Remember this, where it talks about you will do this and this.
Yes.
And some don't think that it's even part of Mark 16, verse 20. But if it's original, there's a sense in which the miraculous was used, Jesus would admit, to confirm that what he said was true, right? His preaching was true based on that he had the ability to also do the miraculous. 17, to draw crowds. Now, Matthew 4, we know verses 23 to 25 give the sense that he does a lot of miracles in succession as though he's doing it to draw a crowd together so that he can preach to them, right? And that's Matthew 5. So shall we say that one of the possible reasons for Jesus' miracles is just for crowd gathering? We have to be careful with that, again, because Jesus will be seen in retrospect to be not too hip on big crowds, right? He doesn't trust, and this is at the end of John 2, he's not wanting to give himself to a crowd because he knows that they probably are after him for the wrong reasons. So I think it's a possible reason for a miracle, but I would never put it as too high on the list.
Yeah. I mean that the whole counter to that, I would think, is, unfortunately, it's a memorable verse because of the number, John chapter 6, verse 66. I mean,
there you go.
It was the whole moment of him essentially forcing this crowd to leave him by saying some outlandish or very crazy sounding things that they eventually like, we don't want to follow this guy. And then you get that infamous verse of John 6, verse 66. And after that, Jesus turns to the remaining disciples. Are you going to leave me too?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, that, I don't think he was ever wanting the attention necessarily. The attention came to him because of the things he did, but he wasn't an attention seeker.
Yep, fair enough. He didn't have a podcast. How's that?
Yeah.
He certainly could have done more to advertise himself. And I'm always amazed how quiet, frankly, his ministry was compared to what it could have been. Number 18, to counter unbelief, as I've read or heard, to counter unbelief. So John 20, verses 30 and 31. Does Jesus ever do something just to say, folks, you don't believe in me, do you? Well, watch this. Now, maybe, again, I would be very gentle with that or careful with that Jesus will do something miraculous to counter unbelief based upon how he says in Luke 16, if someone rises from the dead, that remember at the end of the Lazarus rich man parable, he says if someone rises from the dead, that's probably not going to convince anybody. So I think Jesus knows that the use of the miraculous may not engender belief, at least the kind of belief he's interested in. I just have 4 more that I've read or heard of. Possible reason for Jesus' miracle. Number 19, to expose hardened hearts. That's an interesting idea. John 12:37 is the text that has been applied to that one. To show someone where they're really coming from, he does a miracle and it exposes where they really are all the time. It's very possible. Number 20, this is common, to foreshadow creation's restoration. We know at the end of Revelation 21, verse 4, that the new creation will be from all, with all symbols attached. We know this much, that the new creation will be where God intended to take the old one. And that Jesus' miracles sometimes hint at what that will look like. So maybe no sickness, no hunger, no pain, those kind of miracles that alleviate sickness and hunger and so forth may be a foreshadowing. And here's the king, in other words, doing things on the earth before he comes again with the full restoration. So that's a fine reason. I've heard of that, and I think it works well. Number 21, to show the defeat of Satan. This is something that, again, we'll get to this later in John, which is a book of the 4 Gospels. John is very black and white when it comes to how he sees the ministry, shall we call it, of Satan versus the ministry that he has, the darkness and the light, the either-orness of his crowds. It's very clearly presented in John, so that in 8:44 he'll say to his antagonists, you are of your father is the devil. That's the only place we have that in the 4 Gospels, but that's very strong, and it shows how he sees himself as opposing, Satan or the devil, and there'll be numerous moments in the book of John where even in his miracles, he'll do something which probably shows he is opposing Satan himself as a person and not just a force, something like that. My last one, before we move on, is, or actually return to number 1, is to prepare people for his own resurrection. And I think this is a good point, that like the Lazarus resuscitation in John 11, I think one of the reasons for that is when he resurrects Lazarus and Lazarus is unbound and walks away, I can imagine Jesus looking over his own group there, his friends that would just witness this, saying to himself, well, they have not seen anything yet. This is a prediction in some way that I will myself resurrect too. So anyway, that's the 22 reasons that I put together for why, or possible reasons for Jesus' miracles. And I may have missed some, obviously, but notice that the Bible itself doesn't stop. No one in the biblical record pauses and psychoanalyzes why Jesus does miracles. We have to go back in retrospect and create this kind of a list and work with it from there. So I would like to, Mike, if you have anything else to add, jump in, but I would like to return to number one, because this is where a DCW, for instance, in my mind, forces us to consider the miraculous, right? And watch my logic here as I do it, as we close this portion of John. When we say, and I had this as number one because I wanted to return to it at the end, possible reasons for Jesus' miracles, and I've heard this numerous times on various platforms, to demonstrate that he was God. And notice a capital G by implication there, to show people that he was capital G-O-D. He was God. And now, if you know your DCW worldview thoughts as you've listened either to us or read Dr. Heiser's works or been part of this worldview, I think you know where I'm going to go here, but let me walk you through what I immediately think now that when I hear people say, well, it proves he's God. Here's the problem, shall we say, or at least the question. Would Jesus' miracles have demonstrated to a first century audience that he was G-O-D, capital G-O-D? Or, if you want to be really careful, a person within the Trinitarian Godhead. So let's back up and ask it this way. If Jesus, the water to wine, which we just read in John 2. If a person knows that Jesus just did something like this, change water to wine, would he back off and say, boy, he must be, again, here's our English words coming back to haunt us, he must be God. Well, they didn't have God as a word, number one. We've been through that. Would he have said, well, he must be a theos? Okay, so now that's really where we have to go with this. Would it ever have caused a person to say, he must be a theos? Now, from there, you can tell that opens up a whole discussion. And again, stop me where you'd like, Mike, because again, we're doing this without you knowing my next thought, but here we go. Well, I think what we have, go ahead.
Well, you also carefully used the word that he was a theos. That Jesus is not the theos.
Right.
I think so. So you're being purposeful in using a theos right here in this moment, because I have a feeling where you are going.
Yeah. Okay. So in other words, when someone says God there, or, boy, he must have been, imagine the guy at the wedding. Would he have backed off and said, Jesus is God? Well, no, he couldn't have. He doesn't have English. So now he's limited to theos probably, or Aramaic, if they're speaking Aramaic, Elohim, H-I-N. Well, now we have to think, this is where DCW does get into this miracle. It forces us to go down a path of thinking, and here's the way I'd like to do it. Let's go back and think Old Testament thoughts quickly. Did Old Testament Elohim perform miracles? That is, created Elohim. Is there Old Testament evidence that created Elohim, gods of the first, Testament, gods of the Old Testament, did they do miracles? Again, no one stops and creates a list in the Old Testament. You have to go back and kind of work your way through it and just rethink through everything and ask yourself, interesting, maybe that is. Here's my quick list of 6 things that I have collected over the years. Number 1, the Egyptian sorcerers are said in the text to duplicate Moses' miracles. At least it says it did. Now, some people think they were faking it. It's possible. I remember Dr. Norm Geisler, when I had him at Dallas Seminary, he was a firm believer that those were all faked. And his evidence was when he was in India, he saw people handle snakes, for example, and throw them down and they became a stick, or vice versa. I forget how it worked. But his argument was that all the Egyptian miracles or Egyptian sorcery tactics of Exodus 7 and 8 were feigning miracles. The text does say they did them, so let's just leave it there for now. But my guess would be that these, based on a DCW, that these men were likely tapping into some kind of Elohim level action. Number 2, this is my list, so I get to defend what's on my list, right? Balaam's ability to curse. Remember the story in Numbers 22, the king of Moab hires a god broker by the name of Balaam, who has no interest in honoring the God of Israel. He's there to curse these people. But he then says things out of his mouth that end up being a blessing. It's just a fun story from Numbers 22, I believe, through Numbers 24, where Balaam opens his mouth to curse these people, curse the God of these people, right? And then he says, well, Yahweh is going to bless them. And it's as though he knows, I don't know, it's just hard to know what Balaam's thinking, except you get the feeling he has, this is why he's hired, the ability to actually curse someone through his deity. And that's why the king of Moab is paying good money for him. So my point in putting this into my quick list of Elohim in the Old Testament having power would be, why would I hire a guy who has never once been able to do something? No, I think Balaam had a track record. He had a resume of being able to tap into the divine world. And that's why he was paid by this king to do what he did. And again, God shows his power at that moment and he blesses Israel. But that to me is one of those moments that I put on my list of Elohim having power in the Old Testament. Number 3, the temptation to follow Elohim throughout Deuteronomy. This is Deuteronomy 12, 29 to 31, especially 13, 1 to 3, where God even says, Yahweh says, you're going to be tempted to worship their gods when you go into Canaan, because 13:1, you will see things that make you want to follow them. And when they do those amazing things, that does not mean to follow them. Notice the story there in the DCW mindset. You're hearing God, Yahweh, tell his people, you're about to enter a land that will be littered with, frequented with divine activity. And I don't want you to fall for it. So to me, that shows, or it's a good evidence that Elohim were performing what we'll call miracles, even during Moses and Joshua and so forth. Number 4, the Baal prophet challenge with Elijah in 1 Kings 18. Remember when Elijah says, let's have a bet. Who can bring down fire or lightning, shall we say, from heaven and burn up their altar? The very fact that these Baal prophets, was it 450 of them? They all said yes. Well, why would they have said yes if they had not seen it happen before? To me, again, it's pretty silly of them to go into the bet having no evidence that they could ever do it. My guess is they said, oh, we've done this numerous times. This is something we can do. And that day, Yahweh silenced Baal. But that does not prove that Baal, A, doesn't exist, and B, it doesn't prove he doesn't have power. It just means C, in my estimation, Yahweh gets to call the shots at any given time in the Old Testament, and on this day, he silenced them.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, then also, let's not forget there were also 150 other prophets for Asherah. So, like, let's gang up. Actually, yeah. We're not technically supposed to ask for Asherah, but we'll bring Asherah into it because she's supposed to be the consort and help Baal along too, motivate him.
What was that? 600 against 1.
Yeah, 600 in the end, right? Because we know what happens after they lose.
Yeah,
that we're 600.
What a great story. And again, it all is predicated on the idea that God, or that these people had done it, seen it, could do it again. Otherwise, the story wouldn't have happened to me, in my estimation. 2 more. Again, evidence that Old Testament Elohim can do things, perform miracles. Number 5, the sacrifice of the king of Moab's son. 2 Kings 3:27. It's a very quick, just a, passing statement in 2 Kings 3:27 that the king of Moab, when Israel was coming against him in war, sacrificed his son on the city wall. And it says there was, how's it go? Something against Israel. There was movement in the war where Israel started to lose because the king sacrificed his son on the wall, presumably to Molech. So
it says, and there came great wrath against Israel.
Yeah. So read a good commentary on 2 Kings 3:27. And they'll all admit something must have happened in the heavens here where Molech was aroused to do something against Israel.
Can I recommend an excellent one that I think at least might help people process what the heck is going on in this incident? The Brazos commentary for Kings, specifically by Peter Leinhart. I think that's his name. Okay. he had a very interesting approach, and he provided a lot of background context, because this isn't Israel as in like the United Kingdom. This is northern Israel under Ahab.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought in a lot of other contexts of specific things that God said in Deuteronomy of what to do with these particular trees, especially don't cut them. and a bunch of other things that are going on that makes you wonder, is Yahweh actually like is he not the most amazing chess player in that he can manipulate even the other side's pieces in the end to do something and to teach his own people a lesson? Anyways, I've always been fascinated after reading that passage and then studying it a little bit from the Brazos commentary, that provided a lot of help to process what is going on in this battle of wits between Yahweh and apparently another Elohim.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that recommendation. I think those are always good for everyone to hear. Something that you've read or I've read that can help. Number 6, my last on my self-made list of Old Testament Elohim performing miracles would be the testimony of Jews who are talking to Jeremiah in Egypt when he's telling them, stop worshiping the Queen of Heaven. And they say in chapter 44, verses 17 and 18, fascinating text to me, why would we stop worshiping the Queen of Heaven when she has supplied us with food, clothing, and protection for all these years? In other words, it again makes no sense that this God was not active in the life of these people when their argument back to Jeremiah is, why would I worship a God, Yahweh, who let his people go into captivity and have his home destroyed by the Babylonians when we have come down here to Egypt and been taken care of by the Queen of Heaven, the God that they were worshiping? So again, Jeremiah 44, 17 and 18 would make no sense if this God was not actually, this created Elohim was not actively taking care of his own. So that to me is where a divine counsel worldview starts the story of Jesus' miracles, is looking back in the Old Testament and saying, wait a second, folks, remember these gods, these created deities that Yahweh made have power. And if they have power, be looking for that power to come. Very quickly for time, what I'm going to do is then list on the other side of the Testament, go across to the New Testament and ask this question. And this is a lot easier to find a list or create this list on our own. And that is evidence that New Testament created theoi. Notice these are not capital G gods. These are small g gods. New Testament theoi that can perform miracles as well. So again, let's ask it this way. Is there evidence that New Testament created theoi? These would be the same beings that are in the Old Testament, but now they're called theoi in the New. Could they do miracles? Excuse me. What is the evidence? Number 1, Jesus does a miracle in Matthew 12:24, and they say that's done by the power of Satan. Well, that shows that they must have seen things done by Satan, and they therefore say that's the reason for Jesus doing miracles. So notice Matthew 12:24 presumes that the crowds had seen things that they would call miraculous, and they attributed it to this being called Satan. Number 2, Jesus himself in Matthew 24:24 talks about signs, quote, being done by false messiahs and false prophets. So Jesus, on the lips of Jesus, he tells us that there will be, quote, signs done by false messiahs. Number 3, this is in Mark 1, where a man who is presumably sitting in a synagogue, minding his business, enjoying the synagogue service, Mark 1:21, is then confronted by Jesus, and like the lights coming on and the cockroaches fleeing, all of a sudden this demon speaks out from within this man and says, I know who you are. You're here to destroy me, aren't you? My recommendation of that story is that here's a guy who's going to work every day. He's demon possessed and he doesn't know it. He is a normal looking guy who is worshiping another god to the level that that god has part of his emotion, intellect, and will. Kind of like the Christian today, we're told we are filled by the Spirit. God, through the Spirit, influences my emotion, my desires, and my will. I don't even know it sometimes, but I'm being led by him. I think on the alternate side, we have Thus, a man sitting in a synagogue in Mark 1, the only reason he's exposed for who he is that the Messiah walks into the room. Okay, so why would I put that on a list of performing miracles? All I'm saying is the ability for a demon, a god, to control a person without their knowledge seems to be part of the story that you are introduced to in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And it'll be one at a time. Jesus will meet these beings. Sometimes you know it. They're, breaking chains. And that's my fourth on my list, by the way, the legion of daimonia in Gadara. The Gadarene demoniac who says there's a legion of them in me. There again, you have power over nature to the point that they can control pigs, I guess, or, this man who's breaking chains. So is that making sense? I think what you have going on in the life of Jesus is these people who are being controlled. The Greek word there usually is demonized. That's all it says. And that they could have been living a very normal day-to-day life until they meet Jesus. And then they speak up. So
isn't it interesting that one of the fruits of the Spirit is often referred to as self-control? It's a very interesting kind of thing, because it just seems like, why would I need self-control? Am I not always in self-control? Am I not always in control of myself? And usually we use it in regards to certain vices like alcohol or smoking or other compulsory type of activity. But that is a very interesting kind of concept that, ironically, being filled with the Spirit, you have control. You actually have choice. You have a will that you can express. You are you. And you get to choose whether you obey or not, if you do something or not. And yet, some reason, when you're under the influence of a rival Elohim, you don't get a choice, it seems like at times.
Like that's a beautiful point. Thank you. So again, this is on my quick list of that New Testament theoi could perform, shall we call it, miracles, or at least control nature. I'm up to number 4. Number 5, the stirring of the water of the pool of Bethesda. We're going to study that in John 5, so let's skip it for now. But I think that's an actual moment where these people were being healed at the pool that was dedicated to the Greek god Asclepius. And we'll talk about that in John 5. An actual story of miracles being performed by created deities. Number 6, these are all now, I get into the book of Acts, and there's 5 that I can think of in Acts where a theoi performs a miracle. Quickly, Simon, who is called, it's the verbal form of magos, which is the magi of Matthew 2, actually, but it means sorcery. So Simon who sorceried is how the story goes. This is Acts 8, verses 9 through 11. So whatever the story is, he seems to be a guy who's tapping into divine ability, and he's called by Peter, bound by iniquity. So I think he's not a believer. Number 7, Elymas the sorcerer, Acts 13:6. Again, that word magos, sorcery, is the same word for Matthew 2, the people who showed up at Jesus' home as an infant. And yet we call them magi because I think the text wants to protect them from being called sorcerers. But that's exactly the term. It's funny how our Bible versions protect us from bad words. Simon the sorcerer, Elymas the sorcerer, and the wise men were called sorcerers as well. Number 8, the slave in Acts 16, the slave girl, remember that? Yeah. And it says she has a pneuma puthona. Python is puthona is the Greek word from which we then later get the word python. Notice the snake analogy, divination, snakes, part of that worldview. So this girl in Acts 16 is able to do things that amaze the crowds. I think that's real. And again, when Paul cleanses her of this pneuma puthona, this divination power, her owners are frustrated. So I think something very real is happening there.
Can I also say that people really need to look at that story in particular, because it would be hard pressed to find anything wrong with what she was saying about Paul and Silas at that moment.
She admits exactly the truth. It's a fascinating story. Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
She was speaking technically the truth, and yet the entire ministry of Paul and Silas at that moment, during the time when they did not, cast the demon out or cast the unclean spirit away from her, that no one listened to their message. No one came to faith or expressed allegiance to Jesus. And yet you have this girl who's basically being part of their entourage, and it's saying out loud, you should listen to these guys. And yet no one is.
Right.
And so I do think it's an ironic strategy at times of dark powers, in that they will look like, hey, we're helping you. We're helping you with your message. But in actuality, the very influence and their power, why would anyone want to listen if you're being promoted by a dark power?
And this is the beauty of Screwtape Letters, when Lewis pretends to be a demon. He's saying so many things that are absolutely true to his nephew, Screwtape. And we get to listen in on the truth that this demon has. And we turn it around and realize, why would I do that when I realize that's the truth? And yet that's how a demon understands. It's just a fascinating psychology of how true, or how much truth a demon probably knows, right? James 1, they believe and tremble, or James 2. So I can't wait to be able, in the new creation, somehow psychoanalyze how demons think, because obviously we can't tap in like that now, but they must have information that would be fascinating to know.
Maybe that'll be part of the responsibility of judging the angels.
There we go. Sign me up. I want to know. Number 9 in my list is the Ephesian book burning crowd in Acts 19:19, when Paul is, this guy that rips the clothes off someone. Paul, I know. Jesus, I know. But who are you? And it's a demon possessed guy, and he tears clothes off people. And then it says the people who were so scared by this, they burned their books of divination. So again, why would you have this stuff if it didn't work? And the story of people living in a world where Theoi were doing things. They gave up. There's a story where they gave up on that and they wanted to worship Jesus, the God of these beings. And it's a beautiful conversion story. Number 10, Paul's presumed healing. Very quick story. Again, he gets bitten by a snake. He casts it off, Acts 28:6, and they say, oh, you're a Theos. So again, that would be evidence that in their world, Theoi can do things like keep you from dying. Number 11, sacrifices to demonia in 1 Corinthians 10:20. Again, just said quickly, but I think, why would Paul say it if it didn't have effect? He says, when you do this, you sacrifice to a demon. And he's saying that with a fear of, you are tapping into a power that's very real, very dangerous, and thus, like Deuteronomy 13, stay away. Number 12, Paul's principalities and, quote, dunamai, powers. Why would Paul call these beings powerful if they weren't powerful? Right? Ephesians 1:21, Colossians 1:16. That's 2 of the 6 mentions of Paul about these powers. 13, the signs of the lawless one to come. 2 Thessalonians 2:9. Now, it is called false signs, but that doesn't mean they don't happen. It means they may have a wrong purpose to them or a wrong message behind them. So there's coming a lawless one, Paul says, who will do signs. 14, just got 2 more. 14, warning to test the spirits. I take the 1 John 4 warning, to test the spirits, presuming these are very real, they are very powerful, and when I want you to test them, 1 John says, you're not testing whether they can do stuff. That's presumed. You're testing them for, what do they think of Jesus? That's the question. 1 John 4, 1-3. You test a spirit by what he thinks of Jesus, presuming they can already do quite amazing things. And my last is just the general point that in Revelation 11:7 and 18, 12:9, 13, 3-7, 17, 18, and 19, verse 20. All those references in Revelation have signs or miracles being done by somebody, whether it be a false prophet, the beast, just numerous things happening at the end time. But however you read Revelation, there's numerous ways to do it. Whatever's going on in Revelation, there are numerous signs being done by non-loyalists. And so my recommendation would be that just fits into the story. And that's my list of 15 places, and there's probably more in the New Testament, giving evidence to theoi doing miracles. So do you see the problem? When Jesus does a miracle, it doesn't make him God any more than when Satan does a miracle. Does that make him G-O-D, capital G-O-D? And we'd say no. By the way, let me just throw this at you, Mike, too. This is fun. You can do this with... here's where AI has helped. When I know it's back there somewhere in my memory where the Roman emperor is said to have believed in a miracle. And so I asked ChatGPT, where was that statement made by somebody that the Roman emperor had a sign that he believed in? And it's in Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus. How do you like that name? This is just around the time at the end of the first century. Here's the quote. At the time of Julius Caesar's assassination, the horses which he had dedicated to the river god and which had been allowed to roam freely without being harnessed are said to have refused food and wept. The point being that even in Roman historian thinking, miracles are part of the daily life. And here's an amazing one. When Julius Caesar died, even the horses wept. Tacitus was heard to say, the oracle declared that Emperor Claudius would die soon and that Nero would succeed him, but that his reign would end in matricide. This is, again, an oracle, or the idea that you could tap into divine thinking or the divine mind through an oracle. This is all part of Roman thinking as well. So my point being, and this is, I guess, how I'll land the plane today, with four, okay, here's what we're going to do. In other words, or here's what a divine council worldview should do with miracles in the life of Jesus, at least on the front end, before we get too far into why, or if someone says Jesus' miracles proved he was God, I think a DCW needs to back off and say, well, these four things should be harnessed in our minds before we go that far. Number one, if gods are real, small g, if gods are real, they can do things. They can likely do amazing things from a human standpoint. So number one, if a DCW is real, true, and let's presume it is for sake of argument, that means gods are real and they can do things. And nothing we have said there undermines any biblical argument. In fact, I think if we lived in a third world country today, and here's where you and I have heard these stories from people who have witnessed things that blow our minds, often not in rural America, but if we get outside of our boundary, we hear of things all the time, and that's because these gods are very, very real. So number one is just a common sense, here's what we have as a DCW. Number two, think then of what's going on. Created gods form covenants with their worshipers, whether Old Testament or New Testament or even today. This is, I think, what's going on, that like this, the Israelites were warned not to emulate the covenant that these deities made with the Canaanites. And that's why, because these covenants do include a physical give and take. I pray, they answer. I pray, they answer. That's how these gods work. And that's how I presume the Old Testament is working. When God says don't worship their gods, he means don't get into the practice of asking for things because they're very good at giving you things. And that's the deception that comes with a created deity.
Ron, before you move from that, I do want to ask a question. I'm sure some people have wondered about this too. I know we know from Old and New Testament context, right? Covenants was a thing. Right? And so culturally, it would make sense that the description of interaction with other divine beings, a covenant would be formed, some sort of agreement, right, between the human being and the deity that the person is worshiping or agreeing to worship and offer sacrifices. Mm-hmm. I guess the question I have, what advantage is it for, like, why would these divine beings persist in wanting to create a covenant, even in our modern day, right? When we don't typically think of things like in a covenantal mindset, but what is the advantage for a divine being to receive the worship of another human being? Like, why what is the motivation of that? Well, at least what do you think? Your musings about that?
Do you hear my woodpecker out here, by the way? It's on the side of my house.
I do, and actually I have one just as well at my house as well. They love just knocking on the roof for some reason.
I'm going to let him knock if you don't mind. I could probably knock on my window and make him move, but I love your question, and I don't know the answer to it because, again, and take me, I'm not being silly here. I can't psychoanalyze why in the world would a demon do or a God want a human to worship them back. Now, we've often thought maybe they just want to take as much flesh between their teeth as possible into the next world to bring down people into judgment or something like that. But we don't know that. So my answer is I don't know, but I suspect, again, following Screwtape Letters, there's something about a God that loves worship, especially of a Elohim-like being, such as a human. Remember, being made in the image of Elohim means we have the privilege of communication with them, and they apparently have a communication with us that they enjoy. So I don't know. My guess would be, because I've never been a worshiper of another deity, so I don't know what that's like. But maybe there is a give and take, a beauty, an artistry, an emotional attachment that not only the human enjoys, but the deity enjoys as well. It's possible. I'm speaking outside of my knowledge at that point.
I asked that question because, the last couple of years, I remember there was a TV series that was based on an American novelist series. It's called The American Gods. And this author's conception was that multiple gods exist. And the reason why they need worshipers, it's not that they want worshipers, they need worshipers, is actually because the worshipful imagination of the human worshipers actually creates the God. And in order to continue their existence, this is the American novelist's idea, that for them to continue to exist, they need to garner worshipers. And if they don't, and all the worshipers that they currently have eventually will die off and they will just die, they no longer will exist once the last worshiper dies.
Okay.
And so that's
I don't see
that's
any
part
biblical
of
teaching.
Yeah, it's not biblical. It's just like another secular person trying to answer the question, why is it that human beings have this fascination to worship gods? And so then he's sort of asking the question, well, what is the motivation of these gods desiring the worship of human beings? And so he puts it basically in terms of it's their very existence. Like if they don't have it. I don't think it's biblical.
Yeah. And it's a good question because I have asked that of myself or, of the DCW mindset. Why is it that a demon or a God wants a human to worship? And I don't have again, like I've said, I don't have a firm answer because I think to myself, I hope I'm not pathologically odd. I don't care if people worship me. I think very few humans are that pathologically bizarre that they want human worship. Let's be honest. No, very few humans want someone to worship, literally worship them. Do I want to be liked? Sure. Worship? No. And so yet a God seems to be, maybe it's on that level, but on a divine level where they want to be liked, which means in their world, worship. Something like that. So I don't know. It's again, one of those things I can't wait to find out on the other side.
Yeah.
Getting close to the end here. So again, those 2 points are my first, kind of a therefore, what do we do with this in the end? If gods are real, they can do things. Therefore, this covenant making of the Old Testament, I think was a very real give and take physically. Number 3, when it comes to miracles, a DCW then requires that we view Jesus' miracles as would a first century audience. We can't as a DCW reader of the Bible, just bring Jesus' miracles into our world and say, what would have that been like for me? That would be improper interpretation, right? We have to think in terms of the original audience. What did they think when they saw those miracles? Number 4, this is where, again, I think we can all agree. This is why Jesus advised that human disloyalty to Yahweh could not be reversed, likely, by someone even witnessing a resurrection, Luke 16:31. Why? Because Jesus knew that they knew that they knew that Jesus knew that they already had miracles. The reason that the rising of a dead person won't change the mind of unbelief is because unbelievers had numerous miracles probably in their world that would not be enough, in other words, for a resurrection to say, wow, Jesus is God. I'm going to believe in him now because he can do miracles. Well, no, last week we saw Elymas the sorcerer do stuff. That was amazing. So in other words, I think this is where the American evangelical modern person reading the Bible's got to be very careful. When you see a miracle in the Bible, you don't say, well, that would be cool. I would believe in Jesus if I saw that. No, that's not the world in which the Bible was written. They saw things all the time. And that's why Jesus, I think, here now is the answer to the question. Two things. Does a miracle prove he's God? No. Does a miracle prove he's even divine? No. Elijah did miracles. He wasn't an Elohim, and he tapped into the power of God, but so did Baal worshipers. In other words, even that question of does a miracle prove you're divine? I would say be very careful. It just means we're talking divine power, but we're not talking the being himself being divine. And secondly, putting a capital G, a Trinitarian God concept on Jesus, I think is out of bounds because just of the world into which we have to jump when we read the Bible. I'm done. Anything you want to add as we close?
I think, like I've said this before, and I think some people have misunderstood or they've taken what I said out of context before. But that, and I'll say it carefully, hopefully more carefully this time, but that in many ways, Western society, we are the victims of our own success, right? We've experienced what it is like when the worship of Jesus, the worship of the Father, the worship of the Spirit, when those prevail, and the activity of unclean spirits, of disloyal spirits, of rebels is pushed against and pushed back to such a point that they have very little influence, if anything, on greater society. That we then look back at these accounts in the scriptures and we can't comprehend it because we no longer live in a context where the physical and the spiritual world was so interactive with each other. And so we look at the miracles of Jesus, and of course we would then say in our context, in our time when physical manifestations of the miraculous are minimum.
Mm-hmm.
He obviously has to be God, capital G, right? Like we look at it from our standpoint and vantage point, but we are the benefactors. We are the ones who receive the benefit of essentially many other Christian generations before us, right, who resisted the temptation to worship other divine beings, worship other spirits and other gods. They stayed loyal to the Father, Son, and Spirit. They exercised loyalty to the one Creator. And eventually that worship waned. And so then thus the influence and the power and activity of that worship to other beings waned.
I think you're onto something that needs to be unpacked more and more. And I don't know of any other place to do it except on a DCW podcast. I hope you, the listener, understood where Mike was going with that, because I'm hearing in that little 60-second vignette you gave a huge possible reason why I don't see miracles today from created Elohim. Could it be that my ancestors have been so loyal to Yahweh that they are protecting me from the work of these beings? Is that where you were going? Because that's kind of how I read you.
That was a bit of where I was going, because even in my first year of seminary, my intro to New Testament professor, he introduced this idea in my mind that ultimately Christianity won in the West, in Europe. It won the war against the gods. For the large part, for a long time, it had successfully won against the power of the gods, right? The worship of other pagan gods, the worship of other spiritual beings, that the worship of Jesus, the Father and the Spirit took primacy in the minds of Western society. Of course, now these days, and I remember even, Dr. Heiser talking about it. is that we are seeing a resurgence of the worship of old gods, of pagan deities again.
Yeah.
And
well, he certainly invited that because people contacted him. I remember these stories of a guy who called him and said, I do worship Zeus. You ever hear that story?
Yeah.
He was contacted by a guy, I think he even interviewed him, who said, of course I worship a god. His name is Zeus. He's an old god, but I believe he exists. And it's a fascinating story, the very thing we're talking about. So,
And I think, it's just simply, some people have mistook what I meant, that I don't believe that those spiritual beings exist. It's just simply saying that, like, we have been the benefactors. We've received the benefit of what past loyal worshipers of Jesus, the Father and the Spirit, they have done. They pushed against the worship of other deities. They resisted the temptation to give them loyalty, money, power, any sense of following. And we're seeing now, in some sense, that rescinding of that. But we're starting to see a resurgence within the global South of people abandoning pagan worship to give their worship only to the Creator. And I think that's something that has to be brought into the conversation. That why is it that Jesus was unique amongst all this, right? He did do miracles, but also what drew people to him and eventually led people to come to the conclusion, oh, he has to be Creator.
Yeah.
He's so much better. And I think that's a conversation that we'll have for a long time about what was so amazing about this particular human being who looked like just a simple human being.
Right. Thank you. And let's do this. We are going to be starting to collect questions from our listeners. We've not done this yet, and it's a good thing to do. Questions and even comments, right, Mike? So if you want to send us a question, we'll have upcoming podcasts dedicated to a Q&A. Here's the email address you can send your questions to, and as I say, even comments like this conversation here about, well, whatever we were doing the last 2 minutes there. I think that could elicit comments from our listeners too that we'd love to hear. But here's where you can send your questions. It's questions.dcwp, as in DCW Podcast. So it's questions.dcwp@gmail.com. Send us your questions as you have them. And again, we've talked 50 some episodes now, Mike, and I'm sure there are questions here or there. So you're welcome to send them to that email address. And Mike, you can collate them for us, and we'd be happy to dedicate upcoming podcasts to your questions and comments. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. And we will begin, that was a conversation that just came out of a water to wine story that I realized we handled fairly quickly at the beginning. Again, check your commentaries for all the little details that I'm sure come out of that story. But from a divine council worldview point, that's where we went into the concept of miracles and other gods, which I think was the important side to handle. So, all right, thank you so much. And thanks, Mike, again for being part of this. And we will talk to you all next time.